welcoming you to the introducing course for the Buddhist Society, the summer term course. My name is Rachel Hilton, and I have been a member of the Buddhist Society for well over 20 years. And I've been teaching this course for about 7 or 8 years. What I would just like to say in terms of housekeeping is that we're going to keep the meeting to roughly an hour. I'm going to aim to speak for about 40 or 45 minutes and leave about 15 minutes or so at the end for questions, if there are any questions. The purpose of tonight's course is to start the introducing course, to introduce you to Buddhism. But feel free to have questions at the end if there's anything that's not clear. So this is the Introducing Buddhism course. I'm going to just outline the structure of the course. The course will run for 7 weeks, every Monday evening at this time. And this is the title of each of the talks that I'm going to give. So we're going to start by introducing you to what is Buddhism and talk a little bit about the life story of the Buddha. And then we're going to go into some of the things that the Buddha taught, some of the core teachings. We're going to go towards the end into a little bit more about how you might establish a Buddhist practice if you are so minded. And at the very end, we'll have a session on meditation, and we'll do a little practice meditation in that session. Although there are, of course, other sessions within the Buddhist Society where you can practice meditation. So we're going to begin by asking, what is Buddhism? And I'd just like to begin by saying that during this course, I will be, as much as possible, we'll be using English terms, English words, but there will, of necessity, be a few words that are in either Sanskrit or Pali. You have to remember that at the time that the Buddha lived, these were the Indian languages that were used for religious study and for writing. And there are certain words where there is no exact translation, only Sanskrit or Pali will do. Buddha is one such word, Nirvana is another such word. So where necessary, we will use Sanskrit and Pali terms, but where possible, I will give you the English equivalents where I can. Just to say that we will talk a little bit towards the end of today's talk about the different teachings within Buddhism, the northern tradition, the Mahayana. Most of those writings are in Sanskrit, whereas the slightly older school of Buddhism, the Theravada school, most of those writings are in Pali. Pali and Sanskrit look very, very similar. Pali looks a little bit like a simplified version of Sanskrit, if you like. So the words are more or less the same. So we will have some Sanskrit and Pali words, but I'll try to explain what they mean as we go along. So let's get into the meat of tonight's talk and ask the question, what actually is Buddhism? And it's probably easier to explain what Buddhism isn't, because there are some key differences between Buddhism as a religion and many of the other world religions that some of us might be more familiar with, some of us may have grown up with. So the first thing to say about Buddhism, that you will not find within Buddhism any concept of a God, by which I mean a creator divinity who transcends his creation. We will find in the Buddhist mythology reference to gods and goddesses, but these are, if you like, teaching ways to learn and teach things. There is no, in Buddhism, no concept of a divinity who created man and created the world, nothing of that sort. The second thing that we will not find in Buddhism is any received text, any written book that was handed down from on high that we have to read and follow, and that's where everything is found. There's no equivalent in Buddhism of the Bible or the Quran, nothing of that sort. And there are no commandments, no specific rules that Buddhists have to follow. That's not to say that Buddhists don't have any moral compass whatsoever. Of course, we have our own ethical code and things that we try to adhere to, but there is no written rules that if you transgress, that's it, you're shunned, nothing of that sort. So in that sense, it's very different from some of the other major world religions. And in fact, some people say, well, is it even a religion at all? Is it actually a philosophy or a way of life? And that really depends how much, how you would classify a religion. But there's certain elements within Buddhism of awe and worship and respect for the Buddha and his teachings, which give it a religious element. But in many ways, Buddhism is something to do rather than something to believe. And this is very strongly exemplified in a very, very famous teaching that the Buddha gave to the Kalamas. I always begin the course by quoting this particular sutra. So at the time that the Buddha was alive, there were lots of religious teachers, lots of gurus, lots of people traveling from village to village and talking about their different ways of practicing religion. And it was very difficult when you were in a particular place to know whether this particular fellow was the right one or that particular teaching was the right one. And the Buddha was traveling through a particular part of India, and he came to this particular village, which was inhabited by this sect of people called the Kalamas. And they said, it's what you're telling us all sounds marvelous, but the guy who was here last week said something different, and the month before that, someone else said something different. And the Buddha gave this teaching, and it's really a very important, very important. He said, do not believe in anything simply because you have heard it. Do not believe in traditions because they have been handed down for many generations. Do not believe in anything because it is spoken and rumored by many. Do not believe in anything simply because it is found written in your religious books. Do not believe in anything merely on the authority of your teachers and elders. But after observation and analysis, when you find anything that agrees with reason and is conducive to the good and benefit of one and all, then accept it and live up to it. So this is really a key thing about the Buddhist practice, is that we are asked not just to swallow and take on board what we're told or what we read or what we hear. We're asked to think about it, to put it into practice. And if it works, if it's conducive to harmony and well-being, then practice it. If it doesn't work, if it doesn't work out, if it causes disharmony and disagreement, then don't keep going with it. So you may find at the end of this course that what I've said is not really helpful and that you'd rather not continue with a Buddhist practice. You'd rather go along and carry on with whatever else suits you better. And that's absolutely fine. This is not a proselytizing religion where we're saying this is the one and only thing you have to do. Think about it, practice it. If it works, if it makes things more harmonious and more helpful for you, then by all means adopt some of these teachings. But, I'm not getting commission on the basis of how many of you become Buddhists after this. Please, if it doesn't suit, it doesn't suit. So what else did the Buddha teach? This is a commonly quoted saying of the Buddha. He said, I teach one thing and one thing only, that is suffering and the end of suffering. And lots of people have slightly misunderstood this teaching as, well, that's Buddhists, they're all a real pessimistic bunch. The world is an unhappy place full of suffering, etc. That's not really what the Buddha is saying here. What the Buddha is saying is that the essence of our existence, the essence of everything that we go through in our lives, is somehow unsatisfactory and difficult. And I would rather suspect that most of you have come here tonight for this course because you've got an inkling of the fact that life isn't quite going the way you think that it should. There's something not quite right. There's an itch you can't scratch. Things are rubbing up against you in the wrong way. There is something that's just not quite right about life as it is now. And that is what the Buddha taught, is that life as we perceive it is unsatisfactory and difficult. And we'll go through in the next couple of lectures why that is. But the Buddha taught that's how life is, but there is an end to this. There is an end to the suffering, the difficulty, the dissatisfactoriness of life. There is a different way that you can follow, which will lead to the end of suffering, to a more comfortable, harmonious, calm existence. And that's what the Buddha is teaching us through what he taught and what we try to practice. This is a famous parable which the Buddha gave to his followers, and I've put this into your course notes. He tells a story of a man who was shot with a poisoned arrow, and he is going to die unless the arrow is removed, because the poison is going to get into his veins and course around his body and kill him. So his friends rush up to him and say, let's pull out that arrow before you become poisoned. And the man says, no, don't take the arrow out just now. I need to know some important things. Who shot this arrow? Where was that man from? Which village? Who were his people? Who were his father? Who was his mother? What was his trade? I want to know what was the wood that makes up the shaft of this arrow. What was it made? Was it oak? Was it ash? Was it softwood? Was it hardwood? What was the arrow made of? What was the flight of the arrow? Those feathers, what bird did it come from? And the tip of the arrow, what was it? Is it stone? Was it metal? And the poison that's coating the tip of that arrow, where does that poison come from? What tree does it from? Until I know all of these things, I will not have that arrow removed. I want to know all of these things before you pull the arrow out. And of course, before the man could ever know all of these things, he would have died long ago from the poison. And this is the point of us and our trying to approach a religious practice like Buddhism, is that we have a great desire to understand every last aspect of it before we actually start to practice. And that means that we still have that poison in our veins. We are still living in that unsatisfactory, disharmonious, suffering realm, because until we have understood every single aspect of what the Buddha taught and why he taught it that way, we won't get on and actually do the practice. So the parable of the poison arrow is saying you don't have to know every single thing about every single thing. You have to get on and remove the poisoned arrow, remove the cause of suffering, which is basically the illusory state in which we live. So we're going to cover the Buddha's life story. We're going to start with who he was, where he was born. We're going to find out why he decided to follow a religious life, what it was that brought him to the state of enlightenment that he eventually achieved. We're going to talk about his teaching career, and then we're going to talk about his death, and we're going to talk a little bit about what happened after he died and why Buddhism still survives in the world today. So the first thing to say is that the Buddha was, the name Buddha, it is a Sanskrit name, and it means one who is awake. Someone who's woken from that dream of an unsatisfactory, difficult existence with all the illusions that cause us to suffer. He awoke from that, and once he had achieved enlightenment and started to see things clearly as they really were, that enlightened state, he became known as the Buddha, the one who is awake. But before that, he was an ordinary man. He was born an ordinary man. His name was Siddhartha Gautama. Siddhartha was his given name, and Gautama was his family name. We don't know for certain when he was born. Some sources say 560 BCE, and some say 480. Probably the later date is correct. And he was born in a place in what is now in modern day Nepal. It's actually, if you've been to Nepal, it's in the Taran region of Nepal. So it's just on the foothills of the Himalayas, the north of the plain of the Ganges of India. And he was born in a place called Lumbini. And his father, Suddhodana, was a local chieftain or warrior or king. He was a wealthy man who led the local clan. The clan that that Gautama was born into was called the Sakya clan. There are many mythological elements which surround the birth of the Buddha, and they're shown here in some of these wall carvings. It is said that his mother, Queen Maya, when he had a dream that a white elephant came in and penetrated her through her side, and that was the moment of conception when Siddhartha was conceived. And it's said that when he was born through her right side. We can see here that she's standing up in those gardens in Lumbini, holding onto the branch of the tree. And the Buddha, the child Siddhartha Gautama, apparently was born through her side. These are obviously mythological stories which add that element of mystery, and they're not to be taken as accurate fact. But there was a traveling sage, a wise man, who wanted to come and visit the child, and he saw the baby and he recognized there were signs in the baby that meant that he was going to become a Buddha one day. And he said to the father and the mother, this is this boy has he's going to be a great sage, a great teacher, a great religious leader. And of course, Suddhodana, the father, he wasn't displeased by this, but he had rather thought that his son was going to take over his inheritance and look after his clan and be the next chief and warrior leader of the Sakya clan. So he wasn't particularly impressed with the idea that his child was going to become a religious leader and a sage. So he decided to, thinking that what was likely to turn his son into someone of a religious mind rather than a warrior would be a knowledge of the hardship and suffering of the world. So he decided to protect Siddhartha from these things. So it said that Siddhartha grew up in the greatest luxury. He had a summer palace, he had a winter palace, he had a palace to retreat to in the rainy seasons. He had every luxury that a young prince could have. He had the finest food, the finest musicians to entertain him, the finest clothes. He had lots of beautiful women. He was trained in the princely arts. He was very good at archery and horseback riding and all of those things. And here he is on his wedding day. He's marrying his beautiful cousin, Yasodhara. It's said that he won her hand in marriage through an archery contest. So he was a very, very pampered young man leading a very, very pampered life. He'd got married, and in fact, his wife had a baby called Rahula. And then he undertook 4 fateful journeys of discovery. He decided he wanted to get out of the palace and see a little bit of the world. So he got his charioteer, Channa, to take him out into the surrounding areas to see what there was to be seen. And it is said that he met 4 things on those journeys outside the palace, which really changed his life. The first thing he met an old man. Now, seems almost unbelievable, but Siddhartha had never met an old person. He'd never come across age. He'd been protected from all of that in his cushioned existence. And he said to his charioteer, "Why is that man so stooped?" And Channa, the charioteer, said, well, he's old. We all get old. And the next thing he saw was a sick man, a man lying here on his sick bed. He said, "What's wrong with that fellow?" And the Channa, the charioteer, said, "Well, he's ill. He's got disease. He's sick. That happens to all of us." And then he met a corpse being carried away to the burial grounds. And he said, "What's wrong with that person?" And Channa said, "Well, this is a dead person. We all have to die." And this was a real shock for Siddhartha. He'd been brought up carefully protected from this knowledge of what was inevitably going to happen to him, to his wife, to his child, that he and they were going to age, they were going to get sick, and they were going to die. And he had if you like, a little bit of a crisis, thinking, I can't believe this is going to happen to me and everything I know and love. What can I do about it? And on his last visit from the palace, he saw a holy man, one of the wandering mendicants who would be wandering around India in those times, who was sitting under a tree in what seemed to be complete and utter bliss. And Siddhartha said, "Why is that man not consumed with the anxiety and stress of knowing that there is old age, sickness, and death in the world?" And the charioteer said, "Well, he's a holy man. He follows a holy life." And Siddhartha thought, well, that's interesting. He's clearly found a way to accept what's going on in the world, a way that I'm going to struggle with. And it said that was a turning point, because he was 29 years old, and he suddenly realized that he couldn't continue to live in this blissful, comfortable existence any longer, because he knew that outside of the walls of the palace, people were getting old, people were getting sick, people were dying, and he couldn't live with the horror, really, that had brought into his existence. So one night, at the age of 29, he decided he was going to give up his life as a princeling, and he was going to follow the holy life and see if he could achieve that bliss and contentment that he'd seen on the face of that sage. So he said goodbye to his wife, who was sleeping, and to his child, and stole away in the middle of the night. His horse's hooves were muffled as he left the palace. And once he got away from the palace and over the river, he did this very symbolic act. He cut off his long hair, and he exchanged his princely garments for the robes of a traveling mendicant, a beggar, and set off on his journey to find a solution to the problem which he was now faced with, which is the inevitability of old age, sickness, and death. And he practiced very diligently for the next 6 years. He went to all the great teachers of the day. There were two in particular who he studied with, and he learned all of their deep skills of meditation. He became so gifted that each of those teachers said to him, "You can be my heir, you can follow me, you can take over my school, you've learned everything that I can teach you." But Siddhartha knew he had not discovered the solution to his problem, which is the problem of suffering in the world, old age, sickness, and death, leading to suffering. So he started to do what was very, very common at that time, which was to practice incredible austerities. He would starve himself, he would go without sleep. He got to the stage where, as you can see here, he was completely emaciated. His hair was falling out, his eyes were sunk in their sockets, his teeth were loose. He said, "When I put my hand on the skin of my belly, I'm touching the skin of my back." He could feel his spine through his stomach. He was so thin. But of course, lots of people had gathered around him by this point, thinking, look at this incredibly tough, dedicated, austere, practicing, he's practicing all the austerities. So he had gathered around him 5 like-minded souls, 5 ascetics who were with him, who were equally tough and hard on themselves with their religious practice. And they were living this life of incredible hardship. And then one day, Siddhartha realized, if I carry on like this, I am going to die. I'm very close to death. And I still haven't got anywhere near the solution to the problem that I'm looking for, which is, why is there so much suffering in the world? And I'm going to die without ever having found the answer. So he realized he'd been really taking a misguided route, and he allowed himself to be given a little bit of rice porridge from a passing local woman, and he went to bathe in the river. And when his 5 ascetic friends saw him bathing himself and having a little bit of food, they said, "Oh, look, Siddhartha has taken to the soft life," and they left him. So he'd reached rock bottom. He'd given up his life as a prince. He'd given up his wife and child. He'd lost his friends, his followers. He had really nothing left now. He'd really reached the ground zero, really, for him. There was nothing left. But he decided that he was going to have really one last push to try and discover the truth and discover an end to suffering. And it's said that he sat down under what was called the Bodhi tree. It's a type of fig tree in a place called Bodh Gaya. He found the Bodhi tree, this fig tree, and he sat down under it and he swore a solemn vow. He said, "Flesh may wither away, blood may dry up, but until I gain enlightenment, until I see into the true nature of things, I shall not move from this seat." So he sat down there with a fierce determination. He was going to stay there until he discovered what he was looking for, which was an end to suffering. Now, at this point in the story, a very important character comes in, and this is the character which is the Lord Mara. Mara is, if you like, a tempter. It's not the devil. He doesn't represent the devil or evil or sin or anything of that sort, but he represents temptation. And it is Mara who keeps us trapped in this existence of not really understanding what's going on, keeps us attached to nice things in life, keeps us trying to avoid difficult things in life. And it's said that Mara, realizing that Siddhartha had made this incredibly solemn vow that he was going to stay under that Bodhi tree until he found the solution. I think Mara realized at that stage this man is about to break through and understand and find enlightenment. He's going to escape from the realm of ceaseless existence and struggle. And Mara was determined to keep him where he was in his world, the world of life and death and suffering. So he sent various things to tempt Siddhartha out of this fierce state of intense concentration and meditation. And first of all, he sent his beautiful daughters to tempt Siddhartha with sensual pleasure. But Siddhartha just ignored them and carried on sitting. And then he sent his warrior sons with their spears and swords to try and frighten Siddhartha away from the Bodhi tree and break his concentration. And it's said that when the swords and spears got close to him, they just turned into flowers and petals and fluttered harmlessly away. And then finally, Mara himself came and said, be reasonable. You've been away from home for 6 years. You've left your wife. You've left your child. You've left your responsibilities as the heir to your father. Be reasonable. You've done enough. Come home. It's quite interesting, isn't it? Sometimes when we are trying to do our meditation practice, we're tempted by the sensual pleasures, sitting on the sofa for another half an hour with the book or watching the latest episode of Game of Thrones or whatever it might be. We're tempted to say, oh, I've had such a hard day. Maybe just tonight I don't need to sit in meditation. And sometimes we just say, actually, I'm just not doing it. No. So we go through all of these little temptations ourselves, don't we, when we try to follow our own Buddhist practice. But Siddhartha sat through the temptations and carried on until morning. And it's said that when the morning broke, he came out of his deep meditation. He'd seen into all his past lives. He'd seen into the true nature of existence. He'd seen through it all. His eyes were finally opened. He was awake. And it said that he looked up and saw the morning star. And at that moment, he became enlightened, fully awake. All the clouds of delusion had fallen from his eyes. And he said, how wonderful, how miraculous. All beings, but all beings, are fully endowed with the wisdom and power of the Tathagata. That's not a word for Buddha. But sadly, human beings, due to their sticky attachments, are not aware of it. And this is quite an important and quite uplifting message for us all, actually, because what he's actually saying is you can all be enlightened. You can all see into the true nature of things. You don't have to continue to suffer. If only you could free yourself from these sticky attachments and these delusions. What he's actually saying is you all already are there. You are already enlightened. You are already yourselves Buddha. You just don't know it. Now, that might seem a big ask for us tonight, but hopefully as we continue on through the course, you'll get some glimpses as to why Siddhartha, now called the Buddha, because he was now awake, why he said that. So he sat there for a while in his newly enlightened state, and he thought, well, what I've seen and discovered is so profound, I don't think anyone else will easily be able to comprehend it. And it's said that at that stage, the god Brahma intervened and said, there are some people in the world whose eyes are but little covered in dust. Please come and teach, and then let others share in what you've learned and what you've discovered. So he was persuaded that he could go out into the world and teach. And so the very first people he met when he left the Bodhi tree were those 5 ascetics who'd left him before when he'd had the rice porridge and gone into the river. They saw him coming from a distance. They said, "Oh, there's that man who we thought was such a great practitioner, but turned out to be just a soft lad after all." But as they saw him approaching, they realized there was something had changed about him. They saw that something profound had happened, and they just naturally got to their feet and paid him respect. And his first teachings were given to those 5 ascetics in the deer park where he'd found them. And he was now 35 years old, and he spent the next 45 years of his life traveling throughout India, up and down the plains of the river Ganges, teaching. And he was apparently a very, very charismatic teacher, because people flocked to him in droves. People became enlightened very, very quickly. He gathered a lot of people around him, and apparently his teachings were very, very profound, and he could teach people in language they understood. He could speak to people using the types of examples that meant things to them. So over the next 45 years, he became a great and very respected and revered teacher, traveling through India and teaching until he reached the age of 80, where he became ill. It is said that he got something, sounds really like dysentery. Some people say it was poisoning from eating pork. Some people say it was poisoning from eating mushrooms. Whatever it is, it's clear that he had some kind of a dysenteric illness and he was going to die. And his followers gathered around him in great distress. And they said, "Well, you haven't set anyone to follow you. Who's going to lead the group after you've gone? What are we going to do without you?" And he said, "Well, my teachings are there's nobody who's going to follow me and take over from me. The teachings are what you need to look up to. You need to live up to these teachings and practice these teachings yourself." So he didn't set a successor. He didn't hand that down to another person. He said, just follow the teachings, follow the teachings. And he died in a place called Kushinagar. And when he died, apparently he said, impermanent are all compounded things. In other words, everything that's born is impermanent. Strive on heedfully. So his last instructions for his followers, and indeed for us today, was bestir yourselves. Life is fleeting and short. We need to get on with it and do your best. So his followers carried on, and they traveled up and down India, and eventually they took those teachings down into southern India and down into what's now Sri Lanka. The teachings traveled through Burma and down through Indonesia, across up into the plains of Tibet and across into China, and eventually across to Japan. So Buddhism spread very widely in the next few hundred years after the Buddha's life. And sadly, it almost died out in its birthplace, which was India. And Buddhism is a religion that picks up very much the flavors of the places it's passing through. So as you go down into Sri Lanka or up into Tibet or over into Japan, you'll find different schools of Buddhism, different flavors of Buddhism, if you like. And the schools that we recognize, broadly speaking, there are 3 main schools of Buddhism. The oldest school is the Theravada school, which is shown here in red. And these are the monks that you'll see in Thailand and Sri Lanka in their yellow robes. And they follow very much a monastic practice. And they have their teachings are in Pali, and it's very much a strong monastic tradition with a very strong ethical code. Buddhism traveled up into Tibet and acquired a lot of the flavors of the indigenous religion there, which was the Bon religion. So we get a type of Buddhism in Tibet, which is in the Vajrayana school, which has got different elements of gods and demons and tantra and symbols and things of that sort. Buddhism traveled through China, picking up quite a lot of the religion of the time, which was Taoism, and moving through into Korea and Japan. You'll find Taoism, a very strong influence of Taoism on Zen Buddhism as it's practiced today in Korea and Japan. But the schools of Buddhism that are practiced through China, Korea, and Japan are called the Mahayana schools. And we'll talk about these schools in a little bit more detail towards the end of the course. But one thing that's to say is really important is that no matter how different these people look in their own religious settings, so if you have a Zen practitioner in Japan, or a Tibetan practitioner in Tibet, or a Theravadan practitioner down in Sri Lanka, they will wear different colored robes. They may have different chants, different rituals, but ultimately it is all Buddhism. The core principles are the same at the heart of all of these religious schools. So although they may look different on the outside, it is the core teachings which are exactly the same at the base of it. And these are the things that we're going to learn in this course. And as the Chinese Zen master Yoga Daishi said, let us take hold of the root and not worry about the branches. So don't concern yourself just now whether you prefer to be a Zen Buddhist or a Tibetan Buddhist or a Theravadan Buddhist. Let's just focus on core Buddhist principles at the root of the Buddha's teachings, and not the various little bits and pieces that have been added along the way as people have got more advanced in their different schools. So that is the most of what I'm going to talk about this evening. Important to say that Buddhism it's a practice. It's something for you to do, not something for you to believe. If you put it into practice and it works for you, that's great. If you don't put it into practice, no matter how much you read about it or think about it, it won't get you very much further. And as it says in the Dhammapada, you yourself must walk the path. Buddhas do but point the way. So the Buddha discovered an ancient way to an ancient city, was how he described it. He discovered a way in which we could learn how to not be trapped in this world of suffering, not to be beguiled by old age, sickness, death, sensual pleasure, frightening or unpleasant experiences, not to be swayed by those things, but simply to see life as it actually is, the reality of life. But unless you follow that path, unless you actually set foot upon it and walk on it and keep walking, then it won't help you. There's an old Zen saying that how do you know what salt water tastes like? Well, you keep walking and you walk and you walk and you walk until you reach the sea. And then you stick your finger in the sea, and then you know the taste of all the oceans. Unless you actually walk and keep walking, if you keep heading this way, that way, the other way, you'll end up nowhere. So if you wish to follow a Buddhist path, you will need to walk it. There's no point in simply thinking about it and listening about it and reading about it, but never doing anything about it. It is an experiential journey for you to practice and see how it works for you. So I'm going to finish there. We've got about 15 minutes left. If anybody has any questions, I'm very happy to try to answer them. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Wang Du, do you want to chair the questions?
Yes. I have a question. Are there any historical texts from the time of the Buddha that confirm his existence?
That's a good question. There is limited evidence that the Buddha himself, as the man whose life I've described to you, existed. In the same way, there's very limited evidence that there was such a person as Jesus. But about 100 years after the Buddha died, or within the 100 years of the Buddha dying, his followers came together and recalled all the things that he had taught. And in fact, the Buddha's constant companion, his cousin Ananda, who looked after him and, you know, was his support and his companion, and if you like, his helper in life, had been present at every single teaching the Buddha had ever given. So he was able to recite from memory pretty much everything the Buddha had ever taught. Now, this obviously to us would seem like a tremendous feat, but don't forget that in those days, things weren't written down. It was very much an oral tradition that if people told stories, you would remember those stories. So not long after he died, everything he had taught was recited and committed to memory, and ultimately was written down as a written record. And if you look at the teachings of the Theravada school, that old school of that is prevalent in Thailand and Burma and Sri Lanka in particular, that the Pali Canon is the original teachings that the Buddha gave, his own words as he spoke them, and those were collected as close to his death as was possible, was recollected by the people who'd heard those teachings, and was written down. So we do have written records of what the Buddha actually spoke. Whether we have a historical record of his life, whether he did live as he's said to have lived and in the place said to have lived, there is not a huge amount of historical evidence that was contemporary to his time. But within 100 years or so of his death, people had started to build stupas and religious shrines and religious structures. So I think we have reasonably good reasons to imagine there was such a person at around that time who had those sort of teachings. And we do have a written record of something that was very likely to be what he actually said. But do we know for sure he lived here and he was born there and he died there? I think the answer is the evidence for that is not very strong. But in a sense, it doesn't really matter. You know, if you're a Christian and someone says to you, well, there wasn't actually a Jesus, it wouldn't really matter. You know, what matters is the teachings, and what the Buddha taught is very real and very alive to this day. So whether that person existed at that time in the way that I've told you, or whether he didn't, it doesn't really matter. The truth that were discovered and were written down and that we have with us today are very real.
Thanks a lot.
Joe?
Rachel, thank you very much for tonight's lecture. I live south of Seattle in the United States. About 125 years ago, Buddhism came to the United States through Japan, Pure Land Buddhism primarily, but Zen as well. What school of Buddhism has really made its first appearance, I guess, in England to help inform the Buddhist society? And a second quick question, the story of the Buddha, as you told us tonight, is it universally accepted throughout the different schools? Thank you.
Second question first. Yes, that is the story that I've told you tonight is very much accepted in whatever school of Buddhism you would be in. There are some differences as to when we would celebrate those key events. So the Buddha's enlightenment, in the Zen tradition, we celebrate that in December, whereas in the Southern tradition, that's celebrated in May. But yes, I think those core elements of the Buddha's life and his birth, his life and his death would be central to all Buddhist schools. In terms of which is prevalent in the UK, well, the Buddhist Society is the oldest Buddhist society in Europe, and originally it developed as a theosophical society, which is a slightly weird mixture of some and all religions in particular. But lots of different teachers from different schools have been affiliated with the Buddhist Society and have lent their teachings. So the Buddhist Society doesn't particularly follow one school, but we do have very strong links with various Theravadan groups, particularly Chithurst Monastery and Amritavati Monastery. We also have strong Zen. There's a very strong Zen group based at the Buddhist Society. There's a strong, as I say, a strong Theravadan group. We have links to a Pure Land temple out in West London as well. So you can follow any particular, and Tibetans, of course, I've forgotten the Tibetans, but Roy Sutherwood, who teaches this course other times of the year, also teaches at one of the Tibetan schools down in southeast London. So all schools of Buddhism are represented in the Buddhist Society. There's no one school that is particularly prevalent, I wouldn't have said. We try to give access to all the schools. You can basically decide which one has most appeal and join the courses in that school and see how you get on.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Just flick through. No. Oh, I have two more on the chat. Alex Holly has asked, is there any cause for the seeming disparity between the prevalence of Buddhism versus other major religions? I'm not totally sure what you mean by that question, Alex, other than maybe could you come online and tell us what you meant by that? I suppose it means it's a smaller religion than other religions, but it is nevertheless a world religion. I don't think I haven't answered that question, really. Are there any other questions from the group? No, okay. In that case, I'm going to draw the meeting to a close.
Sorry, Rachel, I received one question through chat. I'm going to forward it to you. Okay.
Yes. Here we go. Is it fair to say that the Buddha epitomized the best of Brahmanism, leading it to a new breakthrough moment? And could there be others who did not respond to the challenge to bring this message to the world? That's a very interesting question. because, of course, at the time that the Buddha was alive and teaching, the prevailing religion was Hinduism, and Hinduism developed from a much earlier religion, the Vedic tradition. So you will find within Buddhism many elements which have clearly grown from a Hindu or a Brahmanism practice background. There are lots of things within Buddhism which echo back to things that were taught in the Hindu religion. So we will talk later on in the course about karma and rebirth, for example. So it's clear that Buddhism is a child of an Indian tradition, growing up on a background from earlier Indian religions, but certainly on its travels through other countries, it has acquired flavors of other religious practices within those countries. So you will find very strong elements of the Bon religion in Tibetan Buddhism. You will find very strong elements, as I've said, of Chan, of the Taoism coming through from China into the Buddhism that we see practiced in Japan today, Zen Buddhism. So yes, Buddhism probably did grow in the cradle of India out of the earlier Hindu and Vedic traditions, and has developed its own differences depending on different countries and different practices. Could there be others who did not respond to the challenge to bring this message to the world? Do you know, if you look into other religious practices and other philosophical practices, you will find huge similarities between many other religions and the Buddhist religion. So even, for example, if you look at Stoic philosophy, many of the elements of Stoic philosophy are very, very similar to elements of Buddhism. So the Buddha himself said that he had found a way to an ancient city, in other words, to the true, seeing the world as it truly is. He didn't say this is the way. He never for a moment said this is the only thing that you can do. This is the right way and there's no other way. And even the Dalai Lama today says don't practice Buddhism to be a better Buddhist, or don't follow my teachings if you like to be a better Buddhist. Practice Buddhism to be a better whatever you are. So elements of Buddhist practice can make you a better parent, a better Christian, a better follower of Judaism. You don't need to be simply a Buddhist and say this is Buddhism is the only thing. The Buddha himself didn't say this is the only way to enlightenment. He said it's a way. I've discovered it and I'm showing you how to follow it. But there will be many other ways to get there, and many other religions will have found those ways as well. And you will find a lot of similarity in Buddhism with other prevailing religions of the day, and also with, as I say, some other philosophers as well. So it's not the only way, it's just a way. And don't think, just because it's the Buddhist practice and this is what you have to do and nothing else is any good. Not at all. There are lots of other things which are very much in keeping with what the Buddha taught and would be in keeping with it following a Buddhist practice. I hope that answered the question. Anything else?
Could I quickly ask a question?
Yeah.
What was it? What new thing did the Buddha bring compared to, say, other meditative traditions that existed beforehand?
What new thing? I don't know what specifically the other meditative traditions of the day would have been practicing, but what he tried and failed was to find any value in extreme asceticism. What he obviously tried and failed was to find any value in living a very luxurious life. So one of the key and important things the Buddha taught, which is, was one of his first teachings really was the middle way, that you shouldn't have extremes. You don't need to be really harsh and severe and bring yourself to death, nor do you have to live a life of extreme luxury. There's a middle way where things are just right for the situation. So I think that was the big difference between him and the other traveling people of his time, was that he was saying, well, you can have a slightly more settled existence. You don't have to be living as extremely as I've been living. You can live a different and a more sort of settled middle course. And that's something we have to remember if we're going to follow Buddhist practices. We don't want to be too extreme. It's no point in saying, this is it, I'm a Buddhist now. No more eating meat, no more chocolate biscuits, no more drinking alcohol. No, I'm not going to celebrate Christmas or birthdays. That's done. No, we settle into our lives and we are compassionate and considerate people with those around us without being extreme. We don't want to push this into other people's faces and say, look at me, I'm a Buddhist, therefore I don't do any of these things. There's a middle way. It's very important. The name of the Buddhist Society journal is the middle way, and that's because it was one of the very first things the Buddha taught. So I think that would be a very important distinction between what really tough meditators were doing around that time and what the Buddha eventually discovered was a more helpful way for him.
Thank you very much.
Mark has asked about no self. Can we park no self until next week, because we're going to cover no self in huge detail next week, and it's a massive topic, and I really can't do it justice tonight, but we will be coming to no self again and again in a lot of detail. Thank you, Joe. We'll miss you next week, but we'll catch up the week after. We're going to draw the meeting to a close now. Next week, we're going to go into some of the principal initial Buddhist teachings. Can I just say, going forward from this week, from the following classes, there will be homework. Yes. So I'll be asking you to do things rather than just think about things. And I look forward to seeing you all next week. Good night.